Hello, this is Professor James Strickler, and this is a course in American government. This lesson is from Unit 11 about public policy. It's Lesson 14 about foreign policy. In this lesson, you'll learn about foreign policy, you'll learn about the lesson of Munich, about the lesson of Vietnam, about the concept of idealism, and the concept of realism. In previous lessons, you learned about the idea of public policy. Public policy is a set of directives that guide government actions. Foreign policy is those directives that guide government actions toward entities outside the United States. Now, when I say entities outside the United States, probably the first thing that comes to mind are other countries, and foreign policy certainly concerns other countries. But it also concerns other kinds of organizations, such as treaty organizations like NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or international cooperation entities that work with multiple governments, like the International Monetary Fund, or business enterprises that have ties to multiple countries at the same time, like OPEC, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, or even private organizations like the charitable Red Cross, which is also called the Red Crescent in Muslim countries. All these are entities that exist outside the United States, but that the United States may have dealings with and have to come up with policy positions on how they will deal with them. When we learned about public policy previously, we learned that public policy can come from the Constitution or laws enacted by the country, or from regulations from the bureaucracy, or even decisions of the courts. Well, in foreign policy, the policies primarily come from the President of the United States. Now, not exclusively. Congress certainly has a hand in all this too. But primarily the President, because he's the one who sends and receives ambassadors, negotiates treaties, commands the military. Most of the ways that we interact with other countries and other entities around the world is through the President. This is why back in the unit about the presidency, we talked about him being our face to the world. So how does a president choose what he will do in foreign policy? Well, there are two conflicting historical lessons that I want to talk about. These are things that have happened in American history that have had a great influence on how politicians, including presidents, view how we should conduct foreign policy. The first of those lessons came shortly before the outbreak of World War II. What was happening at this time in 1938 was that Adolf Hitler had come to power in Germany, and he began to aggressively expand beyond the boundaries of the country that he had taken over. First, Germany annexed Austria, a neighboring country that was ethnically related. Then they began to invade Czechoslovakia. Czechoslovakia doesn't exist as a country anymore. It's now been broken up into two countries, the Czech Republic and Slovakia. But at the time, it was one unified country. But it had areas in it that were dominated, or I should say, had significant numbers of people who were of German ancestry. And Hitler invaded to annex these areas to Germany. Well, this really worried people in Europe at the time, because just a couple of decades before, they had fought World War I, and they didn't want something like that to happen again. So they sought a peaceful solution. And what happened was a man named Neville Chamberlain, the Prime Minister of England, got on a plane and he flew to the German city of Munich and had a meeting with Adolf Hitler. He then flew back to London and famously got off the plane, and then right there at the airport gave a speech where he explained what had happened and declared peace in our time. He thought that he had negotiated a settlement that would prevent World War. Well, what happened was the very next year, Hitler invaded Poland. This is the beginning of World War II. So what happened? Why did Chamberlain think he had negotiated a peace that turned so quickly to fall apart? It's because the peace that he negotiated with Hitler was essentially, okay, Hitler, You've already gobbled up some pieces of other countries. You can just keep those as long as you promise not to take any more. Well, Hitler was happy to make that promise because from his point of view, what it showed was that his supposed enemies, those who would supposedly stop him from gobbling up more, didn't want to fight. That they were willing to give him what he wanted to try to maintain peace. And so he thought, well, I'll just take more then and they'll give it to me too. So the lesson that we draw from this failure to gain peace in Munich was that appeasement doesn't work. In other words, giving in to the bad guy and saying, okay, yes, you did some bad things, but we'll let you get away with that as long as you don't promise not to do more, doesn't work. Because what it shows is weakness by those who are opposed to the bad guy. And in that way, it then invites the bad guy to be furtherly aggressive. You give him an inch, he's going to take a mile. So another way to look at this lesson of Munich is, how should you deal with a playground bully? If you're a kid and somebody comes up and demands your lunch money, do you give it to them? The lesson of Munich is you don't. Because if you do, then the bully will just be back the next day to get your lunch money again. So what do you do instead? According to the lesson of Munich, you punch the bully in the nose, and that's how you get him to leave you alone. So in the case of Adolf Hitler, that means World War II, including the D-Day invasion pictured on this slide. So that gives us the lesson of Munich, the first of the two historical lessons that we're going to draw that conflict with each other, yet both influence American foreign policy. The second lesson comes from the era of the Vietnam War. The Vietnam War was a war fought in Southeast Asia over the future of the country of Vietnam. Vietnam had become divided into really two countries, North Vietnam, which was dominated by communists, and South Vietnam, which was anti-communist, friendly to the United States and other non-communist countries. America became involved in the war because of an idea called the domino theory. See, at this time it was the Cold War. The United States and the Soviet Union were in a struggle for the future of the planet. And they had various countries around the world allied on one side or the other. And the concern for the United States is if one country fell to communism, then the next country would fall to communism, then the next one, and pretty soon they'd be at our doorstep. This is called the domino theory. And so the way to stop the dominoes from falling was to intervene in some early country and say, no more, you don't go any farther than this. So that's why the United States got involved in Vietnam, was to stop the spread of communism, which they feared would eventually spread all over the world. Well, what happened? It was American defeat. Eventually, the United States withdrew its troops, and South Vietnam fell to the communist North Vietnam, and it became one communist country. Well, along the way, over the 20-year period that the United States was involved there, nearly 60,000 Americans lost their lives in the war. It was a horrible experience for our country. It divided our country emotionally, patriotically, spiritually even, I guess you could say. It was a deep wound on our country's history. And that defeat seemed to teach a different lesson to people than the lesson of Munich. The lesson of Vietnam was that power isn't enough by itself. Even though our military was much more powerful than that of the North Vietnamese communists, and even though the U.S. military actually won most battles in Vietnam, somehow they ended up losing the war anyway. They lost the war because they lost the hearts and minds of the people. Not just in Vietnam, but in the United States too. So people looked at this and said, you know what, it isn't enough just to be big and tough. Matter of fact, at times that will actually even hurt you, possibly. So the lesson of Vietnam taught for some people a better way to deal with their enemies. So, for example, here in this slide, we've got pictures of some people demanding the destruction of the nation of Israel. Well, how would you deal with people like that if you were Israel? Well, for some people applying the lesson of Vietnam, they would say a better way then to fight with these enemies is to try to become their friends, to try to coexist together. So with this then, we have our two historical lessons. The lesson of Munich, which is the way you deal with bad guys is go punch them in the nose. The lesson of Vietnam is punching them in the nose may not work, so maybe the way to deal with bad guys is to go try to be friendly and be nice to them and get them to be your friends. Well, these two historical lessons are an example of two schools of thought about foreign policy. On one side, we have what we can call the realists, who embrace mostly the lesson of Munich. On the other side, we have the idealists, who we could say embrace the lesson of Vietnam. Well, what do the realists believe? Can we make it a little more systematic than just these historical lessons? Yes. First of all, realists, when they look around the world, they see the world as full of potential enemies, threats everywhere, possibly. So we need to be ready for them. And the way we get ready for them is that we have a strong military to respond to them. They may try to come fight us and destroy us to hurt us, and we need to be big enough, tough enough to punch back. Now, in doing this, we need to be able to keep ourselves secure and safe. Because the world is full of enemies, we can't be sure who we can rely on. We don't know who for sure we can trust. And even if we can trust them, we don't know that they're big enough and tough enough to take care of things for us. If we really want to be safe, we need to take care of ourselves. That is the realist point of view. And that is the lesson of Munich, really. That when there's a person who's a bully, you need to be ready to stand up against them. And you can't trust anybody else. You need to take care of it yourself. Now, a potential problem for realists, though, is people like idealists look at them and they may think that they are the bullies, that they are oversimplifying the world, seeing it in black and white as, oh, there's a bunch of enemies out there and we're the good guys, and we need to be ready to fight them. That it actually then makes us look like the bad guys since we're ready to fight everyone. That's the idealist criticism of realism. Now let's look at what the idealists believe. Idealists think that everybody out there is potentially a friend, rather than just potentially an enemy. And because they see everyone as potentially a friend, they don't want to be ready to go fight these people. Instead, they want to be ready to work with them through diplomacy, through negotiation, compromise, things like that. And therefore, idealists see their security as a collective thing. Not that we need to be so big and tough that everybody leaves us alone, but we need to be nice enough, trusting enough, and enough to be trusted, that we can work with other people, make a bunch of friends, and in that way keep ourselves safe. Now, there are people who are critics of idealism. Realists may look at idealists and say, you know what, you're a bunch of sheltered fools. Here we have a couple of our cartoons that kind of illustrate this. Or I shouldn't say, well, sort of cartoons. One is a picture of President Obama and Vladimir Putin, the leader of Russia, meeting. You got President Obama talking about that he has a pen and a phone that he can use to talk things over and work things out with people. And Putin says, I got tanks and helicopters, your move. In other words, the idea is that if an idealist and a realist get into a conflict, it's kind of obvious who's going to win. The guy who's ready to throw punches. The cartoon down in the lower left-hand corner shows somebody with one of these coexist vests on, ready to give a hug to a terrorist and let him know that he wants to be his friend, and it labels it a suicide vest. The idea is that idealists can be taken advantage of. They look around and see friends that they want to work with, and the bad guys see them as suckers instead. Well, these aren't just theoretical notions of idealism and realism. They've shown up actually in American politics throughout American history. Here's one clear example. During the 1980 presidential election, you had Ronald Reagan versus Jimmy Carter. Ronald Reagan was very much a realist. Jimmy Carter was very much an idealist. Ronald Reagan, we have a quote from here saying, you maintain peace through strength. Weakness only invites aggression. Very much a realist point of view. We can kind of sum that up with not really a quote, it's a saying that somebody came up with along the way that you might actually see on some people's t-shirts, which is peace through superior firepower. This is very much the realist point of view, and this is the view that Ronald Reagan took with him into office when he became president. Well, he defeated in that election Jimmy Carter, who was very much the idealist point of view. He looked around the world and saw friends that he just needed to kind of be nice to and get along with. Here's a quote from him. Now, this is from years later, but it shows still his attitude. He said that we will not learn how to live together in peace until we stop killing each other's children. Basically, the idea is if we want peace, we need to be nice to each other. A way to illustrate that point of view is some lyrics from a song by John Lennon, saying, all we are saying is give peace a chance. The idea for the idealist is that if you just take a chance and be nice to people, they'll learn to be nice to you too. While the realist says, no, 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 that's when they'll know that they can pick your pocket and punch you in the nose and get away with it. All right, let's review this lesson. What is a concern of foreign policy? Is it war with Russia? Is it trade with China? Is it immigration from Mexico? Or is it all of the above? It's actually all of the above. The reason these are all concerned with foreign policy because they're all concerning our relationships with other entities around the world, in this case, 3 different countries. What is the lesson of Munich? Is it that appeasement doesn't work? Is it that force doesn't work? Is it that diplomacy is a kind of war? Or is it better to give and live? Or a way that it was said at the time of the Cold War with the Soviet Union was, better red than dead. The lesson of Munich is that appeasement does not work. If you try to make nice with the bad guys, they just take advantage of you. What is the lesson of Vietnam? Is it that appeasement doesn't work? Is it that force doesn't work? Is it that diplomacy is a kind of war? Or is it that it's better to give in and live? In other words, better red than dead. The lesson of Vietnam is that force doesn't work. Sometimes, even if you are the big tough guy, you're going to lose. Maybe it's better to try to make friends. So what does a realist believe? Do they believe in peace through negotiations? Do they believe that all countries are equal? Do they believe in peace through strength, or that all people are good? A realist believes in peace through strength. Matter of fact, they think that a lot of people out there are bad and you need to be ready to defend yourself against them. What does an idealist believe? Does an idealist believe in peace through compromise, that all countries are equal, peace through strength, or that all people are good? The idealist believes in peace through compromise. Now, you may have thought that fourth one about all people being good would be answered. Now, idealist thinks that there's a lot of good people out there that we make friends with, but they probably don't think that all of them are good. But there's enough that we can get peace by compromising, negotiating, being nice to other people. That's what idealists believe. All right, that completes this lesson. The next lesson will also be from Unit 11. It'll be Lesson 15 about terrorism.